Good morning. I hope you have your Bible with you. I'll ask you to take it out and turn back to Psalm 15. The book of Psalms, Psalm 15, where we read to begin our worship, will be the focus of our study and reflection this morning. It is good to be here. We are, Beth, Asher, and I, especially thankful to be here. Turns out, as we were thinking about coming this morning, I think between travel and sickness, and then more travel and more sickness, it's been over a month since we have all been here together, my family, at least on a Sunday morning. And when your family, with those, as Mike talked about so powerfully, when your family with those with whom you gather around the Lord's table, just hasn't felt quite right the last month for us. And we feel a sense of wholeness being back today. And I'll tell you, no one was more excited than Asher to finally be back in Bible class. Just kept saying for the last several weeks, Bible class, Bible class. Finally, he can be back. And I think I would be remiss if I did not thank those who have stepped up, filled in my absence. Jordan, of course, preaching last Sunday. And John Albert helping out with the class in the back over the last few class periods. I think David led singing for me one Wednesday night, and poor Mike had to take on one more round of announcements on a Wednesday night, which is, as you know, if you've done it, the worst assignment of all to handle. So thank you to those folks and others, and thank you all for your love and concern. One of the prayers that we've prayed in our house over the last couple weeks is that we would have opportunity and the thoughtfulness to show the same love and concern to others who are in need, as this congregation has shown to us in our relative time of difficulty. And so those of you that reached out and offering your concern and your prayers, the support, the encouragement, offering to bring things, just sending things without asking, thank you for your love. Again, we feel like family, because we are family to you, and this church just means the world to us. Psalm 15. We're going to read it in just a moment. As you noticed earlier, it is not a very long psalm. Three things basically happen in Psalm 15. I'll give them to you up front. There is a question that the psalmist begins with. There's an answer given to that question. And then there is a promise stated at the end in conclusion to that question and answer. A question, an answer, and a promise in Psalm 15. Let's read it together and think about it. A psalm of David. O Lord, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? He who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He does not slander with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. In whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. He puts not out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. A question, an answer, and a promise. The psalmist opens with this question: who can come into God's presence? It's actually a really good question. Those first two lines evoke the imagery of the Old Testament. Who can abide in your tent? We picture the tabernacle of God in the wilderness, and those who would come into the tabernacle to worship God. Who can do that? Who may dwell on your holy hill? That evokes the imagery of Mount Zion, of the city of Jerusalem, and the permanent structure, the temple that was built where the people of Israel came to worship God. Who is allowed to come and worship God? But you remember that the tabernacle and then the temple later, those were simply symbols of God's dwelling place as he lived among his people. So the psalmist is really asking a bigger question. Who can reside in the presence of a holy God? Like I said, that's a very good question. And we might imagine some responses that we would expect the psalmist to give. Who can come into the presence of a holy God? We might expect him to say, well, nobody can come into the presence of a holy God. God is singularly holy. No human being is holy, therefore, no human can come into the presence of God. Or we might expect the psalmist, in the context of ancient Israel, to say, well, the priests can come into the presence of God. The priests can enter the tabernacle. The priests can enter the temple. They're the holy men among us, and they have a special office. They are allowed to come into God's presence. Or maybe in the same context, we would expect the psalmist to say, well, those who have cleansed themselves, they have become ritually pure through the ceremonial washings. They're circumcised. They haven't eaten unclean foods. They've kept all the right customs to be pure ritually in the eyes of God. Therefore, they then can go into the presence of God. But none of these answers, of course, are even considered, it seems, by the psalmist in Psalm 15. Instead, he does give the answer to this question. Who may reside in the holy tent, in the holy presence of God? Well, it's those, as he lists then in verses 2 to 5, who have a certain character and live a certain lifestyle. These are the people that God invites into his presence. And he gives, depending on how you count, 10 or 11. It'd be really nice if it was 10. That would just fit well in ancient Israel. 10 things listed about this righteous man or woman who is invited into the presence of God, and alternates between sets of positives, things that he or she does, and negatives, things that he or she doesn't do. So let's look at these one set or one verse at a time. And as we go, ask, what kind of person is the psalmist describing? And with most of them, we'll also consider, are there Bible characters we remember that fit well these attributes so we can picture in our minds what this looks like? But of course, with each one, we mainly want to ask, do these qualities and characteristics describe me? And I think it'll be an opportunity for good self-examination and reminding us what it is that God expects of his people with whom he desires to dwell. And maybe especially at the end of the year and the beginning of a new one, and we're in the mode of self-reflection and self-examination, this will be a helpful exercise for us. Who can come into God's holy presence? The first set is in verse 2, when the psalmist says, it's he who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. This is in many ways, I think, the summary statement. This is what God is looking for. He's looking for people with lives of integrity and righteousness and truth. But I want you to notice in verse 2 the inside-out nature of the righteous man's character. Starting with the third and working backwards, this person speaks truth in his heart. I love this statement. Maybe we think about Psalm 1, a passage that talks about the man who delights in the law of the Lord. He meditates on it day and night. The man of Psalm 15 speaks truth in his heart. Meditating on God's word, he is, maybe very literally, talking to himself all the time. And as the righteous man or woman talks to himself at all times in his most private and solitary moments, he or she is speaking truth. They are saying things that are true according to God's word. And they're not speaking things that are untrue, and they are not believing lies. Instead, it is truth that is firmly and deeply rooted in them at all times. But then from then, moving back to the second one, this person then works righteousness. The truth is not just an inner meditation or something that they think about to themselves. This commitment to God is not just an inward thing, but they work righteousness. This person does the right thing. Their actions demonstrate their character. But then maybe finally the first statement, this person walks with integrity. They don't just do the right thing, that's how they live. It's not just something that this person does, it's who they are. It's a walk. It's not just isolated incidents of doing righteousness. It's not just actions here and there. This is the life the person lives consistently, continuously. It is progressive, it is forward moving. This person is growing all the time, walking with integrity, because it's not an act, it's who they really are, even in their most private moments. But it's expressing itself all the time as they walk in this integrity and righteousness. Maybe the first Bible character we should think of is the person to whom this psalm is attributed. I think about David. And think about this. The Psalms are largely attributed to David. About half of them David wrote. And think about what the Psalms are. The Psalms are this inner conversation that David is having with himself. He's often wrestling with his own thoughts, his own fears, his own anxieties. But in the Psalms, David is speaking the truth to himself, always coming back to remind himself about God's faithfulness, about God's covenant love to him, about the futility of wickedness and the ultimate downfall of the evil one, and his own personal commitment to be faithful to God. The Psalms are a great example of speaking truth in your heart. It's what David was doing when he composed the Psalms. But we know from the life of David that this commitment to truth and righteousness was not just something that David meditated on in his own quiet moments. It's something he lived out all the time. And David is maybe incredibly impressive in this regard, that when he was a boy and the shepherd of his father's flock, living in obscurity, he was committed and devoted to God. And then even when he was king of Israel, always in the public spotlight, the world at his command, still he lived in integrity and commitment to God. Because David's righteousness was not just something that he said, it wasn't just something that he thought about, it was who he was, who he is. And so what about us, I would ask? Is our faith something that we have in our mind and our heart, but no one would really know about it because we don't walk that walk? Or is our righteousness something that we do and talk about for other people so that they will see it, but in our hearts and in our quiet moments, we believe the lies that Satan is telling us? And when no one is watching, we fall prey to his temptations and lose our commitment to the truth of God. Hope we see from Psalm 15 that neither one of those things, whether it's inward only but not expressed, or whether we say it out loud but don't live it in our private moments, neither one of those things are truly faith or truly righteousness. No, the man or woman of Psalm 15, by contrast, is genuinely, consistently righteous when they are alone, when they are with others, every day, living a life of integrity from the inside out. And so we move on to verse 3 then, as we start to see specific expressions of this life of integrity. The psalmist says in verse 3 that the person who can reside in God's holy hill does not slander with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend. This verse reminds us of the foundational biblical truth that righteousness before God depends greatly on how we treat other people. Our righteousness before God depends greatly on how we treat other people. 3 specific statements are made. The righteous person doesn't slander with his tongue. His words towards other people, his words about other people are gracious. They are not evil. The righteous person doesn't do evil to his neighbor in verse 3. His actions towards other people are for their good and not for their harm. And then finally, the third one says he doesn't take up a reproach against a friend. That's a little bit of a curious one. It could just mean what it sounds like in our translations, which is that this person doesn't insult or pile on and ridicule against a friend, although that wouldn't be that hard to do. Most people are nice to their friends. So it could be that the psalmist is saying that this person will not cover up a reproach of a friend because he treats all people the same, doesn't show favoritism, and is not going to go easy on somebody just because they are a close friend or acquaintance. No, the righteous person of Psalm 15 treats every person, friend, enemy alike, with kindness and with integrity and righteousness. I think about Moses in this regard. Numbers chapter 12 tells us that Moses was the meekest man who ever lived. By the way, Moses himself probably didn't write that. If he did, he might have negated that statement by penning that himself. But it's an interesting context in Numbers 12 for the Bible to say that Moses was the meekest man who ever lived. We remember Moses as someone who had a unique and extraordinary relationship with God. He saw God and talked to God face to face on the mountain. No one was as close to God as Moses. And he was charged with leading a people, and honestly leading a people who treated him horribly. They were constantly grumbling and complaining and questioning his authority or rebelling against him. And yet, in spite of all of that, the Bible says he was the meekest man to live on the earth. In fact, in that passage, his own brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, have questioned his authority, have criticized his leadership. And what does Moses do? Fly off the handle, insult them, berate them, speak evil of them, spread rumors about them behind their back? No, Moses really says nothing to them and simply goes before God and says, God, you handle this. You take care of this, and we'll submit to your decision. And a few chapters later, number 16, when Korah and his friends rebel against Moses' authority, he does the same thing. Simply takes it to God, submits himself to God's leadership and God's decision, and does not take it out personally against Korah and the others. So what about us? Does this great example of Moses to respond to others, especially or even when they are bad to him, to respond not with meanness, but with meekness? What about us? It sometimes seems to me, I notice this in myself, sometimes seems that we just can't help ourselves when we talk about other people. Maybe we talk about other people too much is the first problem. But sometimes it seems like we can't help ourselves from talking about other people and bringing up their flaws, bringing up their failings, bringing up a story that embarrasses them. Why do we do that? Why do we feel this incessant need to bring other people down a peg in the way that we talk about them? Is it to boost ourselves, that we're just too insecure and we have to bring other people down to feel better about ourselves? I'm not sure. And so, instead, do we speak about and treat everybody with kindness? Speak well of them. Whether they are our friends and can repay us and speak well of us and compliment us in return and do good things for us, or whether they're people that are not like us at all, very different, maybe people that we even don't like or are enemies in some respect. Still, friend or foe alike, speaking of people not with slander, but with, again, integrity and honesty and kindness. The man or woman of Psalm 15 guards his tongue diligently so that his words do not harm other people, no matter who they are. But the psalm goes then a step further, I think, in Psalm 15, verse 4. Again, who can live, who can reside in the holy hill of God's presence? Verse 4 says, in whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fears the Lord. This is an interesting one. Righteousness, it turns out, extends beyond the words and actions that we say and do towards other people directly. And it extends to the way that we even just think about them and view other people who are trying to serve the Lord or maybe not. And so there's a basic contrast that's laid out here in verse 4. The righteous person, that says, in his eyes, a reprobate. What's a reprobate? Your translation may say a vile person, someone who's turned away from the Lord, someone who's not serving the Lord, they're living in wickedness. The righteous person, that says, in his eyes, a vile person is despised. What are we to do with that? I thought you're supposed to love the sinner and hate the sin, right? That's a Bible verse somewhere, I think, But the righteous person, I think the psalm is suggesting, looks at those who reject God, looks at those who have turned away from God, who reject God's law and God's truth, and he's hurt by that. And he actually holds those people in lower esteem. He has less respect for those people because they do not honor the Lord. They've turned away from God. He's not going to honor them. He's not going to praise them in their wickedness. Not what a righteous person does. Instead, the next line says, he honors those who fear the Lord. He looks at those who are righteous and he celebrates that. He praises them. He commends them for it. He thinks highly of people who are trying to honor and serve God as he is. You can tell a lot about someone by who they support, who they celebrate, who they talk about, who they post about, who they wear t-shirts of, have posters in their room, so to speak, of. So what about us? Do we compromise our integrity as the people of God by celebrating politicians, athletes, entertainment stars who are brazenly immoral, ungodly, or exemplify an ungodly character? I worry about that sometimes. And so I'll just say this. Let's instead reserve our praise and our attention and our likes and our shares and our posts for those who are living their lives in the fear of the Lord, trying to do the right thing and live in godliness. Let's talk about those people. Let's honor those people. Let's support those people. Let's honor those who fear the Lord. The man of Psalm 15, what he's doing is he's seeing people the way God sees them. He, of course, desires the well-being of all, just as God does. But he rejoices when people seek God and is hurt when people reject God. And then the rest of verse 4, I think, is a separate item and one of my favorites. He says that the righteous person swears to his own hurt and does not change. What does that mean? Well, as you know from your own personal experience, living a life of integrity means staying committed to doing the right thing even when it's hard. And this is what I think the verse is saying. He swears to his own hurt. He commits to doing something. He takes an oath. He takes a vow, says, this is what I'm going to do. And if it turns out to hurt him, the consequences of that decision to do right are painful in the end. He doesn't back out. He doesn't change. He doesn't budge. Swears to his own hurt and does not change. Not just saying he'll do the right thing, but following through regardless of the consequences. I think about Daniel in this regard. I'm going to assume that Daniel made his commitment to serve God faithfully before he ever ended up in Babylon. Could be wrong about that. But I imagine that Daniel, as an even younger man than Daniel chapter 1, living still in Judea, said, I'm going to serve God, I'm going to follow him. And then just within a few short years, where is he? He's in exile. He's living in a foreign land under pagans. He's standing before the most powerful person on the earth. And yet he doesn't change his resolution. He stands firm and says, I will not eat the food of the king's table, even though he knew the consequences that that decision would bring. And Daniel never changed or wavered from that. In fact, decades later, as an old man, he had had this established habit, this commitment of praying every day, facing towards Jerusalem. And when the law was implemented that says, well, now praying to anyone other than the king is a capital offense, lose your life for that, thrown to the lions, Daniel didn't waver. He had sworn to follow the Lord. He had made an oath, a vow, a commitment to serve Jehovah God. It didn't matter what consequences stood in the way. He wasn't going to give up that commitment. So what about us? I would be ashamed to admit and to reveal the commitments that I've made in my life, the things that I said I was going to do, and then they fell by the wayside when it got hard or when it was difficult to follow through with that. What commitments have we made to do something for other people, to do something for the church, to do something for our family, and then given up on it because it was just too hard or the consequences were too painful? There probably for each of us are specific things, but what about the most general thing of all? What about our vow, the oath that we took when we were baptized into Christ? The marriage vow to our husband and to our Lord. What about that oath? What do we do about that when it gets hard to stay faithful? When it's to our own hurt to serve the Lord or to keep our commitment? The man or woman of Psalm 15 has given his or her word, and that word is enough. No matter how much it might hurt to stay true to it, they do not go back on that commitment. And then finally, and maybe a very particular example of this principle that he's just given, verse 5 gives the final set and maybe hits us where it hurts the most, our wallets. He says, the righteous person does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. As much as we may resist it, as much as we may try to sweep it under the rug, as much as we try to look the other way when the Bible talks about our money, Psalm 15 is just another indication that living righteously changes. It affects the way that we view our money, the way that we use our money. And there are two specific elements given here, which had, I think, specific application, practical application in Israel, may have practical application to us as well, but if nothing else, the principles, I think, are vitally important. First, the psalmist says that the righteous person doesn't put out his money at interest. Deuteronomy 23, verse 19, forbid the people of Israel from charging interest of their brethren, of the people in Israel. Why was that? I think the idea is that in Israel, in the community of God's people, to give somebody a loan was a way to help them out. They are in need, and so you give them a loan to help them. And God didn't want his people helping others and then finding a way to make a profit off of that, make a little more on the side. But then the second one says that the righteous person doesn't take a bribe against the innocent. So you think of more of a legal setting where someone is on trial. They're innocent. They're not deserving of punishment, but the person who's deciding it is offered a little something on the side to look the other way or to bring an unfair sentence against this person. Deuteronomy 16, verse 19 says that a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. God wanted his people to treat the innocent fairly, to look out for those who were in need, to act wisely. And as we all know, as soon as you introduce the possibility for making a little money on something, good judgment and clear thinking and wisdom go out the window whenever there is that prospect of gain. I'm reminded, I think it'll maybe be a circuitous route back to our point here, but I'm reminded of a story Steve's brought to our attention recently in a different context. In 2 Samuel 24, when David is told by God, there's this pestilence going around killing a bunch of Israelites because of David's own sin. And so to stop this pestilence, to stop the angel of death, God tells David, go to the threshing floor of Araunah and build an altar and offer a sacrifice there, and then my wrath will be appeased. So David goes to fulfill the word of the Lord. And when Araunah finds out what David is commanded by God to do, he says, here's all the stuff. Just take it. It's all free. I'm delighted that you're here, David, honored that this is the place where God commanded you to do this. The wood, the animals, the sacrifice, it's all yours. I want you to think about that for a second. How many of us would have, without even a thought, taken Araunah up on his offer? I mean, think about it. God commands me to make a sacrifice and to build an altar. I'm doing what God told me to do, right? I'm not disobeying. I'm performing the sacrifices God commanded. And it just so happens that because Araunah was nice, I'm not out any, right? I don't have to pay for any of it. It's a win-win situation. I can obey God, and I can keep the money that I would use to buy all the materials. But do you remember what David said to Araunah? He said, no, I won't take it from you. Because he said he knew, and he had a commitment that he would not offer a burnt offering to the Lord of that which cost him nothing. David knew what I think Psalm 15 is reminding us, that to serve God costs us. And yes, that means it costs us financially to serve God. And to complete the connection here, we remember, just from earlier in the psalm, not to mention other Bible passages, that to serve God means to serve other people and to help other people. And so if serving God is going to cost us, and it's going to cost us financially, and serving God means serving and helping others, guess what? That's going to cost us financially as well. There's no escaping that, I don't think. But when we put our own financial gain ahead of the opportunity to help and to serve others, I don't think we're that much different from those who took a bribe or who charged interest in ancient Israel. I mean, think about it. In both of those specific instances, there's this tension between helping somebody else or making a little bit for myself. So when we are faced with that same tension, there's an opportunity to help and serve, opportunity to give generously, but we know that that's going to put us out a little bit, money and wealth that I could use for myself. When we choose that, we've done what Psalm 15 says the righteous person does not do. We cannot serve God and money. And so the moment we refuse to dip into our wealth to help others, our integrity has been compromised by a love of money. Instead, the man of Psalm 15 is more committed to his righteousness than his financial gain. And the man or woman of Psalm 15 holds tighter to his integrity than he does to his money. Who can dwell in God's holy hill? Who can live and abide in the presence of God? Again, I think verse 2 is the summary. He who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. And so the promise then of Psalm 15 verse 5 is, he who does these things will never be shaken. It may be that the message of Psalm 15 doesn't quite sit very well with us, especially those of us who are familiar with the New Testament message of salvation only by the grace of God and not by our own righteousness. You remember, most likely, that in Romans 3, Paul says unequivocally, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then those of us who are justified as a gift by his grace. What's even more interesting is that in Romans 3, as the lead up to that conclusion that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, Paul rattles off a bunch of Old Testament quotations to prove his point. And one of them is from Psalm 14, just before the psalm that we've looked at this morning. You'll notice there, if you're open to Psalm 15, just a few verses ahead, Psalm 14, verse 2, Jehovah has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. Are there any righteous people out there? Verse 3 says, they have all turned aside, together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Paul quotes all of that and says, that's true of every individual that's ever lived. No one is righteous before God. And so, is Psalm 15 saying something different than that? Is Psalm 15 contradicting the message of Psalm 14 or of Romans 3? Is Psalm 15 setting us up for failure by saying, here's the standard you have to live up to, but guess what? You can never live up to it anyway. Or is Psalm 15 maybe just a vestige of works righteousness from the Old Testament? So just throw it out and don't even try to attain to it in the first place. Well, as you can imagine, I don't think either one of those things is true. Instead, I think Psalm 15 actually gives us the answer. I think Psalm 15 does implicitly tell us how it fits into the message of the Bible and even the message of the gospel. And does that, I think, subtly in the opening and in this closing promise. I mean, think about that opening question. Who may dwell in God's holy presence? Who may abide in your tent? I think we see that question itself recognizes God's holiness, and it acknowledges that it is only by God's grace and mercy that he would even allow anyone to come into his presence. Who is allowed? Who may dwell? And God is a holy God. Only by his compassion that he would let anybody come into his presence. And then this final promise in verse 5, he who does these things will never be shaken. I think we hear in that promise a statement of God's protection and his love and his faithfulness. It's not a statement of the self-sustaining or self-reliant power of the righteous individual. And then especially, I think, if you put Psalm 15 in the larger context of the Psalms. Think about those Psalms and what they are. Think about all that the Psalms have to say about the lives that each one of us live, and all the things that are in our lives to threaten to shake us. Wicked men who seek to harm us, sickness and death, events of life that we don't understand, our own weakness, our own sin. The Psalms are full of these things and the threat that they pose to the people of God. But God, in his grace, has invited us to come and take refuge in his presence so that we will not be shaken by those things. God has asked us, has brought us by his mercy into his holy hill. But not only does he offer us protection and refuge from the things that threaten us, he's done something maybe even more amazing. He has invited us to take on his character, to become like him. Because again, there is no escaping the fact that God is a holy God. And as he says in the book of Leviticus to his people, you must be holy, for I am holy. So God invites us into his presence to shelter us and to protect us. And in doing so, invites us and challenges us to take on his character, to live lives of Psalm 15. To live lives of integrity and righteousness and truth, so that by walking with him, even in a world of pain and darkness and death, we can be sheltered. We can be protected. And the man who lives the life in God of Psalm 15, by the grace of God, will never be shaken. And as we close, we're going to sing a song, not about our own righteousness, but about the one who makes us righteous. The great physician now is here. Psalm 15 is what God expects of us. Psalm 15 is what God is inviting us to, but we are in need of God's healing through Jesus in order to attain to that. And so this is an opportunity as we close here for anyone who needs that healing, whether to have your sins washed away for the first time in the waters of baptism, or to get help from your brothers and sisters here who love you and care about you. You are subject to that invitation. Come to the front as we stand and sing this song.